lovely to see that we have people from around the Diocese of Leeds and also from across the country here this evening. A very warm welcome to all of you. Just to introduce myself, I'm Jemima Parker. I work as the Environment Officer for the Diocese of Leeds and have oversight for the carbon net zero strategy for the diocese. And it's a real pleasure to be hosting this webinar this evening for the Towards Carbon Neutral Churches Craven group. Our running order for this evening is in a moment I will introduce each of the members of our panel, and then we're going to be watching the video produced by the Towards Carbon Neutral Craven Churches Craven group, and then hearing from a Locogen, their consultant engineers, and together with a perspective from the diocese from Lisa McIntyre and myself. And then we're hoping to have a substantive amount of time for your questions. So as I say, please use the Q&A button to post your questions. So without further ado, I'd like our panel to introduce themselves to you, and we'll start with the Towards Carbon Neutral Churches Craven team. If they could introduce themselves in this order: Diana Linford, Peter Edwards, Leslie Higson, Isabel Rathborne, Catherine Birtwistle, and then Sue Rathmell.
My name's Diana Linford. I've been the coordinator for the Towards Carbon Neutral Churches in Craven project for the last year, and my church is St Mary's MC with Eastby. Peter.
Hello. Hello, I'm Peter Edwards. I'm part of the team. I'm also at St Mary's MC in Eastby.
Hello, I'm Leslie Higson. I'm also from St Mary's MC with Eastby. I'm the treasurer of the group, so I see that the bills get paid.
I'm Isabel Rathbone. I'm the TCNCC representative for two churches in the group, Holy Trinity Church Skipton and St Augustine's Drafton.
Hello.
So we're going to, who are we going to next?
Me.
Kathy. Kathy.
Hello, I'm Catherine Birtwistle, and I'm from All Saints Church in Burton in Lonsdale, which is about 30 miles from the other churches in this group.
And finally, I'm Sue Rathmell from Carlton St Mary's, a small village church just across the river from Skipton.
Thank you. And now to the Locogen team, to Charlotte and Leah.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Mitchell. I'm a mechanical engineer and a renewable energy consultant at Locogen.
Hi, I'm Layla Tavendale. I'm a senior renewable energy engineer at Locogen.
And then to the Darson team that we have on the call this evening, to Lisa.
Hi, I'm Lisa McIntyre. I'm the secretary for the Diocesan Advisory Committee.
Thank you all. And I'm going to hand over to Diana, who's going to introduce the video.
Thanks. We're going to start with a film which we've produced because dissemination and encouragement to others is a very important part of this project. And we designed this film to be usable as a starting point for PCCs and others. And we found that it's worked well in setting out the issues for discussion. So Peter, if you could show the film, that'd be great, thank you.
It becomes ever clearer that climate change is the greatest challenge that we and future generations face, a true horseman of the apocalypse. without swift, decisive action, the consequences of climate change will be devastating. Indeed, for many, those consequences have already begun. As a Christian, I believe in the words of Psalm 24, "The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it." We are the stewards of God's creation. It's our sacred duty to protect the natural world we've so generously been given, as well as our neighbours around the world who will be first and worst affected.
The Church of England has a target of being carbon net zero by 2030. And as part of our research into this issue, 3 of us from St Mary's attended a webinar on funding for a feasibility study into renewable energy generation. We had the full support of Marion, our incumbent, to set up a small group of local churches to work together on the project. And we've found it really useful working with other churches because we've been able to support and encourage each other on the way.
I'm vicar of this church here, St Mary's with Eastby, and I've been here for 18 months. And when I looked at what the church was asking for their new priest to do, there were very strong issues of social justice, of fair trade, of ecology, and I thought I'd love to take that forward. I was so excited to have a church that already had a foundation in this and wanted to take it further forward.
But it began with just a phone call and a group of the very well-informed people at MC St Mary's to say we have a group being planned, because one of the features for the discussions about carbon neutrality is that, well, individuals, people will talk within their own household, and in the same way the church will talk within its PCC and express concern about consumption, about sustainability, about the cost of electricity or whatever. And by coming together with 4 other churches, it has made an amazing difference. Each of us involved individually has said that to share the questions, to the concerns, has been hugely important.
Going carbon neutral is a priority for the whole Church of England, and the diocese is part of the Church of England. And the reason for that is that it's one of the 5 marks of mission, that we should strive to safeguard creation and seek to renew the face of the earth. And there's an urgent need for that in this time, and Christians have got a role to play in leading the way. So the Episcopal area that I look after, the Ripon Episcopal area, is quite large. It includes all of the Yorkshire Dales National Park. We've got a range of market towns. So there are lots of different types of geography and location and churches, some of which are quite isolated, and some of which are quite well connected. So I think there's something important about churches seeking to find ways to work together to achieve carbon net zero.
So the next stage for the carbon neutral churches in Craven project is, well, we'll get the results of the feasibility study for each of the churches. So that's currently ongoing at the moment. I think by December, we're looking to have their proposals put to the PCC. Once those proposals go to the PCC, then we've got a job of work to do. We have a look and we think, well, between now and 2030, what are we going to do? What are the diary entries we put in place? What are the challenges we put in place in order to make the feasibility study a reality? And it's not just something that goes on the bookcase, you know. So by December, there's some interesting questions for us, and quite exciting ones, I hope.
We have such a wonderful building here, but it's a very cold building. It's very, very difficult to heat. The only way we can heat it properly is by using an obsolete oil boiler. We want to make it a community space that people in the village can use, but we need it to be a warm space. We don't want to continue to use fossil fuels. It becomes a priority that we get rid of our boiler and that we go for some alternative form of energy.
I think the biggest problems we've encountered so far are really about how we're actually going to achieve meaningful reductions in our carbon targets. Because of the age of the buildings, trying to work out where you're going to site particular facilities is a real issue. So, you know, obviously we're waiting for the consulting engineers' reports, but for example, we might get solar panels on our South Transept route, but structurally, is that going to be sound enough? So, you know, that's an example of the type of problem that I'm sure we're not going to be the only church that's going to encounter that as an issue.
At Grafton, we have been looking at air source pumps and solar panels. We found that we can't do the ground source pumps because there isn't enough room, but we could do ground solar panels.
We're going to be doing two main things. One of them is going to be generating electricity for ourselves, probably using solar panels. And the second is trying to replace our gas boiler, probably with a heat pump of some kind. Now, the heat pump is fairly well concealed, but solar panels are not. And it will be important to bring our village community along with us in actually understanding why we're doing that, what its benefits are, and maybe some of the sacrifices we're all going to have to make in order to reach carbon neutral status.
Well, we're hoping that we'll be able to help other churches to get involved. The diocese has devised a 6-step programme so that people can start small. There's no need to feel overwhelmed by this target of being carbon neutral by 2030, but you start small and you build small steps as you go along, and eventually, hopefully, you know, you achieve that target.
So the diocese is helping churches who are wanting to reduce their carbon footprint by having a toolkit. So we've got a saving creation strategy. So there's lots of really good things on the website. There are webinars, but the toolkit is a really handy way for churches to work their way through certain steps. So, for example, one of those steps is essential energy actions. In 2019, 21% of all of church emissions were caused by electricity. So if we switch to renewable energy sources, then that's reducing that to zero. So actually there are lots of practical things that churches can do in their own way, step by step, as we seek to achieve carbon net zero together.
We started from a position of knowing very little about these issues, but we strongly feel that by working together and by taking small, achievable steps, all churches can achieve this target of being carbon net zero. We think that the churches in this project will achieve the target of being carbon net zero by 2030, and you can do it too.
Thanks, Peter. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the project. The starting point for the project is the Church of England's commitment to be net carbon zero by 2030. And the Towards Carbon Neutral Churches in Craven group is a diverse but representative group of 5 churches who came together, as Jemima said, to apply for a grant for a feasibility study into renewable energy generation. And we were successful in getting a grant from the Rural Communities Energy Fund. We feel very fortunate to have received this funding, and an important part of our project is the dissemination of lessons learned widely so that other church communities and other heritage bodies can benefit from our project. Our feasibility study involved a desktop analysis of energy use, followed by site visits to each church. And we now have a detailed report which includes a great deal of background information on carbon reducing strategies, together with recommendations for each church. And the full report is available to download from our website, and Jemima is going to pass on the links to all these things after the end of the webinar. The engineers recommend that we install solar panels to generate electricity. These can be roof mounted or, in 2 cases, ground mounted, depending on the site. This will generate enough electricity in the summer months to satisfy our need, and in the winter months we will need to continue to buy in from a green electricity supplier. The engineers did not recommend the use of battery storage for any of our churches. They recommended the use of supplementary electric heating with the aim of heating the person and not the space. Now, the most important part of the plan will be the replacement of the use of fossil fuels. At my church, MC with Eastby, 82% of the carbon emissions come from the gas boiler. So we believe the way forward is to have a staged implementation plan. We intend to start in the first 2 to 3 years, probably with the installation of our solar photovoltaic panels to generate electricity. We believe that this will be beneficial in a number of ways. We'll be able to use the electricity ourselves. We will contribute to the availability of green electricity in this country, and it will be a clear statement that the Church of England is taking the issue of climate change very seriously and is doing something. We also intend to install supplementary electric heating, and this will reduce our dependence on the gas boiler. We intend to continue to research options for replacing the boiler. We have a recommendation that heat pumps might be the way forward, but at the moment these are very expensive, so this won't be the first thing that we do. We also asked about the possibility of installing electric car charging points, and this was found to be possible, but probably only affordable where a church has a car park immediately adjacent to the building. We also researched funding options, and it's likely that funding for the installation of net carbon zero work will come from a mixture of grant funding, match funding from reserves where available, and fundraising. We've found it extremely useful to be part of a group of churches working on this together, and we strongly recommend this to others. And we fully intend that churches in the project will be net carbon zero by 2030. So now I'm going to hand over to Charlotte from the Locogen team for some input from them.
Thank you, Diana. So the goal of our feasibility study was to identify energy systems that would allow carbon neutral operation for the churches. And the biggest source of emissions for these by far was in each case a gas or oil boiler. So this is what we address first. When considering changes to a heating system, the best thing to do is usually to look at energy efficiency in order to reduce the heat demand and lower the costs associated with installing a new system. So that's things like roof and wall insulation, draft proofing and double glazing. This, however, wasn't a major focus of the study though, as options can often be limited in churches because of their listed status. So the main source of heat that we recommended is air source heat pumps, as Diana mentioned, because these are a cost-effective low-carbon heating system. There's other technologies available, for example, biomass boilers. These tend to require a lot of manual interference and are not suitable in many residential areas due to air quality impacts, and also ground source heat pumps, but these can require quite a lot of land and are much more expensive than air source heat pumps. And just to clarify what a heat pump is, briefly, it's the technology that draws heat from ambient air or the ground or a water source and uses electricity to upgrade this heat to temperatures suitable for space heating and hot water provision. So guidance from the Church of England proposes that heat pumps are used to provide low-level heat, so say around 16 to 18 degrees to churches round the clock. This suits the heat pumps as they prefer continual operation, and also the buildings, as maintaining a constant temperature can also help to preserve building fabric in older structures such as churches. And then, as Diana mentioned as well, to provide additional heating during church services, we recommended infrared panels, again in line with Church of England advice. So these are cheap, electrically driven panels, and they send out a directional stream of heat, which means that they warm up people directly rather than the air in the room. And then, of course, because these heat pumps and infrared panels increase electricity demand of the churches significantly, we then recommended solar PV to reduce the running costs and emissions associated with this electricity demand. Because electricity, of course, does have emissions associated with it, but these will reduce over time in line with the government's net zero legislation. In most cases, we recommended rooftop PV installations. There are many options for this, for example, roof integrated panels to ensure that the visual impact is sympathetic to the setting, because we're aware that's something that's very important and for churches in particular. And where roofs aren't suitable, ground-mounted solar PV systems were also recommended. Other renewable energy generation technologies are also available, such as wind and hydro turbines, but these are not suitable in most residential locations, so they were out of scope for a project. And as Diana mentioned, we also looked at batteries, but as we usually find to be the case, they're not cost effective because their high installation costs don't allow for a financial payback. So just to summarise, we recommended air source heat pumps to provide low carbon heating, infrared panels to provide additional heating during services, and then solar PV to reduce the costs and emissions associated with increased electricity consumption. There's obviously plenty of detail and nuance that we can't cover in a few minutes, so I'll leave it there. I think Diana mentioned that the report is available online, and Leila and I will be happy to answer any questions later on. So that's me, thank you.
Thanks, Charlotte, that's great. I'm now going to just pick up a little bit from the diocese perspective. We're very conscious in the diocese that the 2030 carbon net zero ambition from the Church of England is very ambitious and challenging for many of our churches, including our rural churches. Although we're also aware that it is an appropriate response to the current climate crisis, and actually part of how we can share the good news of the gospel at this time. So as the diocese, we've endeavoured to produce a raft of different resources available to support our churches, remembering, of course, first that we need to have our response rooted in our love for God's creation and our compassion for the whole of humanity and all of God's creatures. So we have an extensive theological and worship series of different resources on our diocesan website, where you can tap into those to ensure that the theological perspective is the grounding, the root of our response. We've also created, as we heard in the video, the 6 steps to carbon net zero church toolkit. This is a practical tool to help churches on this journey. And essentially, this is assisting churches to make a plan, and so that they can have a phased approach over the next 8 years. And like the churches that we have represented here, we're encouraging churches to measure their carbon emissions using the energy footprinting tool from the online parish return system to ensure that you take those quick wins actions first, and ensure you've got good maintenance of your buildings in order to reduce the carbon load from heating damp buildings and such like. And then think about long-term planning for the harder items, such as replacing the heating system and generating renewable electricity. As part of our 6 steps to carbon net zero toolkit, we also stress how important it is to see this as part of the whole church's mission, and to be sharing the work that you're doing on this journey with the wider community, so that they can understand our value of God's creation. And also within the diocese, we're providing a range of training and support including a 7-session creation salvation course to support parish environment officers. And later this year, we are going to be piloting a 1-year eco mission course to equip our lay folk across the diocese to deliver on the challenges of net zero. And we have a team of area environment champions, and our Darcy Environment Group have a team of voluntary and staff advisors to assist as well. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Lisa McIntyre, the DAC Secretary now.
Thanks, Jemima. I'm going to speak a bit about what we've been doing as a diocesan advisory committee, though I'm aware, having seen all the attendees commenting where they're from, that there's DACs across the country that will have their own policies or own approach to this. And I've also noticed some non-Church of England people here as well. So I'll give a brief summary of what we're doing, but aware that I'm speaking to quite a national audience here, so this won't apply to everyone. So the Diocesan Advisory Committee, most people attending will be aware, is an advisory committee and not a decision-making body. But what we've done in the Diocese of Leeds is that we have produced a sustainability policy and guidance supporting that, which sets out the kind of things that we want to encourage PCCs to think about when they're submitting applications for works to their building. So it ranges across various topics, including stuff around churchyards, biodiversity, building materials, heating, lighting, renewable generation, sustainable design, water management, transport and access are the various categories we cover. And obviously some of those applicable to biodiversity is a bit different, but most of these topics are applicable to trying to achieve net zero and how to do that. And the way we've written the policy is intentionally trying to enable and inform rather than restrict people. So lots of the wording is around the DAC will positively view applications that ensure that they've investigated various options for heating possibilities. And there's a lot of focus on some of the stuff that's already been mentioned around trying to first reduce heat loss and reduce energy consumption before then moving on to things like switching energy generation through solar panels and that kind of stuff. So we've deliberately, we've put out this policy, but we've deliberately accompanied it with guidance, which helps to break down some of the terminology that we use. And it also includes kind of first steps on how to address these things that you might consider if you are approaching a consultant, the kind of questions to ask them. And we're really aware that lots of people are doing this all around the country in different dioceses, and that there's lots of organisations looking at it, particularly the Church Buildings Council, the national body dealing with churches. So we're linking to all the guidance in there, rather than trying to recreate the wheel. So it links directly to Church Buildings Council guidance and all that kind of stuff. So it's a source for our diocese, but it can be a source for anyone really across the country. It helps a kind of root in and the things to think about, because we're really keen to support parishes on making these first steps. And we also have advisors to the DAC, a couple of sustainability advisors who are experts in mechanical engineering and that kind of stuff. And most DACs across the country will also be able to provide access to those kind of people for churches interested in looking into this. So I think that's a sufficient summary of where we're at. We want to move on to the next bit.
Thank you, Lisa. And we are going to move now to our time of Q&A, and I'm going to hand over to Peter to host this.
Okay. Thank you, Jemima. You've, I suspect, all been following what's going on. It's really happening in parallel. There's a lot of comments and questions, answers, responses coming up in the chat, which I'm sure you'll have seen. There are also some specific questions. There are a number of common themes which are coming out in a number of places, and I'm just going to start with some of those. Can I begin? And I think probably this starts off with our two LocoGen consultants. There's quite a lot of questions and comment about why we're not going into storage, or why batteries weren't recommended. Logically, surely it makes sense to actually store electricity when we can and bring it back. So I wonder if you'd like to expand a little bit on what some of the issues were around those and why the recommendations that we've got emerged.
Sure, I can take this one, hopefully. Yeah, as you were saying, Peter, it always makes sense on the surface to consider batteries because they're providing an opportunity to use electricity that's been generated on site, and that would usually seem like a cost-effective option. There's two main issues, really. The first is that batteries are very expensive technology compared to other energy systems technologies, mainly solar PV, because they're usually talked about together. So the cost has to be justified unless they can be fully grant funded, which isn't usually the case. So in terms of that just means the cost has to be justified by providing a financial payback over the lifetime of the battery, which itself is short. Batteries last around 10 years compared to solar panels, which last about 25 years, which means you have less time for that cost to pay itself back. And the second issue is that there's a lot of constraints surrounding grid connections in relation to batteries. So in order to avoid very expensive sort of £5,000 to £10,000 worth of grid connection costs, which vastly would outweigh the cost of a battery to begin with. In order to avoid them, you can only really install quite a limited capacity of battery, which means that you'd be talking about storing energy from maybe 2 to 4 hours worth of solar PV generation. So that's usually quite a lot lower than one would expect. I think people usually have the idea that you'd be able to sort of store up a week's worth of solar PV generation and then discharge that all during a Sunday service. But in reality, you're only really working with a few hours worth of energy generation, and then that will be discharged probably within an hour if you've got a heat pump. So I think I'll probably leave it there because I could ramble on for forever, but I hope that explains a little bit. And we see this for all kinds of buildings that we look at when we do these kinds of studies. And I think it's not just a case for churches, and people are always a bit disappointed, but it's just the way it is, really.
Okay, thanks, Charlotte. That's really helpful. Another theme which is coming up a lot is the whole question of background heating, as opposed to maybe infrared panels. And there's a couple of dimensions here, I think, and they're going to be different people. Can I put you on the spot, Lisa, with your very clearly capital A advisory role, as you reminded us? A lot of these things we're talking about here traditionally would have upset traditional building conservationists, not necessarily to a point of having apoplexy, but they have concerns. Could you talk us a little bit through how the DAC in Leeds certainly is going to look at some of these technologies?
You mean particularly around the
solar panels?
Okay. Yeah. Sure. I wasn't sure if it was on the background heating debate. I know that.
No, sorry, that's coming in a minute.
Okay. Oh, okay. I know that's exercised our advisors coming from different angles and different opinions a lot. So it's all very hotly debated, and I think that's a way into saying there's lots of different opinions still on the diocesan advisory committees because they're made up of different experts and different interests. We are seeing an increasing number of applications of these kind of nature, especially around solar panels, as you've mentioned. We've not had an awful lot, so we've not had an awful lot of tests, but the kind of thing we are looking at are the usual things we would look at in terms of a faculty application, if people have dealt with faculty applications in the past. And it's stuff around making sure that you've really understood your building and what's important about your building and what needs preserving and what can accommodate change through a statement of significance, and then through a statement of need, explaining what the use patterns of your building are, how frequently it's in use, the kind of people using it, what the needs are, and looking at options appraisals, making sure that you kind of really set out the different ways that things might be achievable. Like a statement of needs is always supposed to be about what your ultimate goal is, not cutting straight to what the answer is. So we would expect people to be through quite a rigorous process with consultants and looking at all the different possibilities before proposing a change. And we would also expect, I think it's come up a few times, about making these changes first to reduce the energy use before going into bigger interventions like solar panels. So we'd be quite skeptical if an application came forward for a church wanting to put on solar panels, but it was evident that they still had a leaking roof, for instance. So there was damp penetration problems, which were making it necessary to use more heating up. And this is like really consistent with the Church Buildings Council guidance is similar. They want that to be a kind of really rigorous demonstration of what has been done to think about the background to the proposals. And various groups like the Victorian Society will take a similar approach. All of these groups are moving towards more of an acceptance that something needs to be done, because there won't be more buildings if the whole earth isn't around much longer. So there is an expectation that solar panels will try to be less visible, so that views of a listed church are not affected. So the appearance of a listed church isn't affected, but it's not actually restrictive. And we've had quite a bit of debate in DAC about actually, is visibility of solar panels indicative that we are doing something positive for the environment? So it remains to be seen. It's a case-by-case basis, but our attitude at the moment is actually nothing is impossible. So long as it's technically possible and the roof can support solar panels, we're open to possibilities and exploration.
Thank you. Okay, well that's giving us an encouraging nudge in the right direction, isn't it? I was talking about background heating, and I'm not quite sure whether Layla and Charlotte, this is one perhaps to come in. I'm just looking down the chat. There are a lot of points there, and there are some in the questions about the desirability of background heating in an old building, what sort of temperature is appropriate. Some people saying it's hugely expensive to keep it going 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. As my understanding is, the whole point of a heat pump is it ticks away all the time, broadly up to its desired temperature. But can I hand over to the two of you to actually give a rather more technical answer?
Yeah, of course. So heat pumps are the sort of or one of the most common ways forward that people talk about when we talk about net zero carbon. The reason being that a heat pump can be 300% to 600% efficient depending on the type of heat pump it is. So an air source heat pump would typically be about 300% efficient. So for every unit of electricity that you buy, you generate 3 units of heat. We talk about background heating because in a lot of these old rural churches, there are huge problems with damp, there are huge problems with rot and subsidence and problems like that can be resolved if building fabric is better maintained. And generally that can be done through maintaining a sort of low level background heat that stops that damp from ever occurring and stops the building from shrinking and expanding so rapidly when people come in early on a Sunday morning and turn the heating up to full and then turn it off again when they leave at Sunday lunchtime and the building's not used again for the rest of the week. Thermal principles state that a building will then sort of expand and contract, creating cracks in the wall and issues like this. So to have an air source heat pump or other heat pump system that maintains a low level background heat is much better for the building. It's also, I mean, the organs have been brought up a lot, but it's the same level there. A constant temperature rather than fluctuating temperatures protects that, protects the organ a lot better. there was another point I was going to make there, and it's just completely gone out of my mind. Oh, integration with solar PV and heat pumps. Another reason why the battery systems weren't so effective was that there wasn't a lot of spare electricity left over to charge the battery if we had the heat pump system running constantly. So that electricity that's been generated, if it's not being used for lighting or audio-visual equipment, can be used to power the heat pump. So effectively running your heat pump for free. Background temperatures, I would say anywhere between about 10 and 16. But largely it depends how you use your church and what's happening throughout the week as to what background level you decide to set it at.
Thank you. Can I just make a comment? We're not going to get through all the questions, I'm afraid, are we, Jemima? I'm conscious of you. I just one or two comments which I'd like to share, if I may, before switching back. The first is that we came into this not to save money, and we're finding when we're discussing with our PCC and with local people, an awful lot of people's perception about this whole area is, oh, well, you put solar panels on your roof and you're actually going to save some money. That's not how it works. If we're genuinely trying to get down to carbon zero, carbon neutral, we're talking about investment. And the reason which sums that up, basically, I think, is the split, the 80% of our carbon production coming from our gas boiler, as opposed to the 20 which we spent on lighting and other electrical uses. And so therefore, I think one has to accept there is going to be a cost associated. Now, what I would perhaps pass back to the panel, anyone who's got some thoughts on that, is where might this funding come from? We can all go and look for, charitable foundations, and we can apply for these. We're familiar with that. It's a skill which we have in churches. But is there any sense that the national church is looking to do some funding?
Do you want me to come in on that one, Peter?
I think you'd be a good
I think you were looking in my direction.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the first, just to give some good news, is that the diocese already has a buildings fund where churches can apply for small grants up to £5,000 for building maintenance or small projects that would take them towards carbon net zero, for example, a lighting project or something similar. And that's been put in place specifically because the diocese is aware of the funding need, but we are conscious that is a small fund. The national church doesn't have the kind of resources needed to be able to offer grants to all of its 16,000 churches across England, and yet a lot of work has been done by the National Environmental Team researching this whole area, and they've initiated a project where a number of different wayfinder churches and schools and clergy properties, because we have to decarbonise our whole estate, are being looked at. And there's a webinar coming up in March with the findings of those, and I can I'll put the link to those the Church of England webinars in the email that will come to you tomorrow. And I think we need to be encouraged that the funding bodies that churches would normally go to for funding are beginning to shift their focus, and they're beginning to have environmental funds that lend themselves better to applying for funding for these kinds of projects. Of course, they're always interested in the use of the building and the building being used for community projects.
Thank you. I mean, I think one of the points that comes out, and again, look at people's comments, is we have learned, I think, through our last 12 months on this, that actually it's going to be really helpful to have a dynamic plan for how all this is going to progress. Yes, we've had a feasibility study. Yes, it's given us a huge amount of information. It's given us recommendations, but it certainly hasn't answered all of our questions. And so what we're looking at, I think, in our parish and the other parishes in the group of 5 is going to be to produce a sort of probability plan where you can start with the things which are most likely to happen, as Diana said, but there are some other things which we're going to have to work out a bit more, partly because of technology, partly because of local people's opinions, partly because of funding. But that doesn't mean we can't start now. And it would be quite easy to think, well, until we've got all the ducks lined up, we can't really start anything. And I think that would be a big mistake. And I think we've gradually come more and more to that opinion as the year has gone by. There's one more question I'd just like to throw out, and it's probably going to be from our 2 Locogen experts. Maybe anyone else have a go. It's by far the most popular question so on. So how about thoughts on the impact of up and coming increase in energy prices? How long is a piece of string? Charlotte and Layla, do you want to have a shot on some of that?
I can take this if you want. I did a lot of research on this earlier today. In the last 6 months, it's obviously been a tremendous step change over and above what we're used to, largely due to the fact that about 1/3 of the electricity that we use in this country comes from burning gas. So we've had a bit of what they call the perfect storm of issues that have occurred. China decided that they would start paying more for gas. So obviously people now would prefer to sell their gas to China than they would to sell it to Europe. China and Brazil also largely rely on hydroelectric power. And it has been a very bad year for hydroelectric power, which means they have a higher demand for gas than normal. Increasing tensions in Russia. Russia generates an awful, or drills for an awful lot of the gas that we use. And increasing tensions in Russia mean that it's more difficult to get gas from Russia. And also there's been problems in this country, specifically around lower wind yield than usual. It's been less windy in the last year than it has been normally. There's been outages in our nuclear and coal burning power stations. And so everything has sort of gone wrong at the same time, which means that our electricity prices and our gas prices, which then push our electricity prices higher. It's not something we can easily predict when it will be fixed, but we as consultant engineers don't foresee this going on for longer than about 2 years. Hopefully it will right itself in time, although whether we'll ever get back to the prices that we were used to paying before, I'm not sure. In this country, we're very lucky in that we do pay a lot less for gas and electricity than they do across most of mainland Europe. There's some quite interesting visuals online if you want to look that up. We have to sort of wait and see what the government wants to offer really in terms of helping the people out. But hopefully in time, this will right itself and the instability will correct itself.
Thank you, Charlotte. So, yeah, I'm glad you were there. Now, I know that, Jemima, you want to move on to about this point, but I'm also aware that the several of the panelists are going to go on being around after the formal bit comes to an end, because I can also see we've only just scratched the surface of lots of these questions. So if you have got time and you want to stay on at 6 o'clock when you come to the end, do please do so, because there will be people around who can actually try and move them around a bit more. So back to you, I think, Jemima.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, we've still got a string of questions, so we'll hold on for sort of 10 minutes or so at the end if you wish to stay to hear more answers to questions. But I'm going to hand now to Diana just to say a few words.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so as part of our Towards Carbon Neutral Churches in Craven project, we feel, as I said before, that it's important that we share the lessons that we've learned and that we're still learning. So I hope you found the webinar useful. We think our key recommendations to other churches who are just getting started are: make a team in your church, do some research and have a look at our website. And Jemima will send out the link to you. We've put some information on our website for some pointers on what we've found useful, because there is a lot of information out there. As has been said a few times, take small achievable steps. make an action plan for getting to carbon zero by 2030. And we think this will be best done in stages. Certainly, we're going to do it in stages. We've found it really useful working with a group of other churches. Keep your community informed and engaged with what you're doing, and start to think about fundraising. And we're very happy to be contacted if you think our experience is helpful. Our email address is on our website, and as I say, Jemima will be sharing details with you after the webinar. So I'll hand back to you, Jemima.
Thank you, Diana. And just from the Diocese perspective, we've been delighted that the Towards Carbon Neutral Churches Craven group have taken this step and worked through this feasibility study and have been so willing to share what they've been doing. And we just really encourage you, if you're starting on the carbon net zero journey, not to do that alone. As Diana said, work with churches alongside you, near you, or get in touch with us in the diocese if you're in the Diocese of Leeds, or if you're further afield, with your diocesan environment officer or your DAC, and make use of your diocesan training events and resources, as well as the raft of Central Church of England resources, both an excellent webinar resource there, as well as guidance notes. And if you're in the Diocese of Leeds, we'd love you to join our environment forum, where you can post questions and answer other people's questions. If you've done the research already on, say, green gas, or you know where to find a good source of information, then you can help others as well. And our forum, environment forum, is on the Diocesan Learning platform. It's very easy to register on there and to join the forum, which again I'll send you the instructions for when I email you tomorrow. We would also be interested in setting up some local forums to assist on the technical side and on the planning application side for projects like this, as well as researching into funding. So if you're interested in any of those three areas, do get in touch with me or with the Churches Together, the Carbon Neutral Churches Craven group as well. So we thank you very much for attending. It's clearly been a topic which has interested many of you. There have been 160 plus people on this call. We're all very much, I was going to say, at the coalface of this, but we need to find a renewable expression, a carbon neutral coalface expression to help us with the language of this journey that we are going on. So thank you for your time with us this evening.